You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Damon and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 41.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Today's podcast is brought to you by audible.com. If you sign up for a 30-day free trial, you'll be able to download Charlie Engle's new audiobook, Running Man, a Memoir, for free. All you need to do is come to borntokickarse.com/episode 41 and click on the big Audible button. All you need to do then is sign up for a free 30-day trial with Audible, and you'll be able to download Charlie Engle's new audiobook, Running Man. Basically, there's over 200,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So yeah, once again, I'd highly recommend signing up for a free 30-day trial at Audible. And once you've done that, you can download Charlie Engle's new audiobook, Running Man, for free. Just come to borntokickarse.com/episode 41. Charlie Engle is a former cocaine and crack addict who has gone on to win a number of the toughest ultramarathons in the world. Charlie is also one of the stars of the legendary documentary Running the Sahara, which was produced and narrated by Matt Damon. Running the Sahara chronicles Charlie Engle, Zahab and Kevin Lin's successful crossing of the entire Sahara Desert, in which they ran back-to-back marathons for 111 days straight without a day off. In this interview, Charlie goes into detail about addiction, suffering, his new book, Running Man, a Memoir, and running his own Badwater while locked up in prison. Enjoy the interview. Charlie Engle, welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Glad to be here.
Congratulations on your book, Running Man.
No, thank you so much. It's I'm really excited that you've had a go at it and that you still want to talk to me.
Yeah, no, it's probably one of my favorite books now. I do have a handful of, favorite running books. There's, Dean Karnaz's Ultramarathon Man, Born to Run, and yours is right up there now as well. I'm not much of a reader, but I listened to the audio version of your book.
Yeah.
Did you have to audition to get the narrating part in that?
I did. That's very good. I always laughed at that. But I guess it does make sense, right? Just because you can write doesn't necessarily mean that you can read out loud. And if the publisher is paying good money to do the audiobook, they want to make sure that it sounds good. So I'm happy to say that on Amazon, actually, the audiobook's been number one in a bunch of different categories pretty much since it came out. So apparently I did all right.
Yeah, no, I loved it. It was, you could almost, I reckon that is almost a script to a movie. You know, your life story, and, you do go into detail around, your late teens through to now. You could almost pick that as a script, like a movie script.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I have had some really great inquiries from film companies, and I do actually have an agent in that part of my life, and she is actively negotiating, and it's it's interesting. I think that it's probably because my life has been filled with some pretty significant lows, and then also some fairly dramatic highs, and it makes for a cinematic quality. And writing the book, I tried to be very direct, and to write it in a fashion that I'm not trying to prove to the reader that I have a big vocabulary, or, I'm not trying to impress in that way. I'm really just trying to tell a good story, and one that keeps moving. I always say it's just like 100-miler. You continue to move forward no matter what, and sometimes you're gonna have some struggles, and the goal is to get to the finish line.
Now, we'll definitely get into your running career, but how's the promotion of the book going? Has it been pretty flat out since you published it? Have you been doing sort of heaps of promo work and stuff like that?
I have. It's been interesting too, because the world has changed so much in how to promote things. I've done a lot of in-person promotions at bookstores, at running stores, a variety of other things. I spoke at a giant Google function and a big convention in Chicago a few weeks ago. But what's interesting is, because of the nature of the electronic world and podcasts like yours, and it's much easier and more effective to reach hundreds or even thousands of people through a podcast than it is to go sit at a bookstore, because, even the most well-promoted bookstore event probably has, between 25 and 50 people there. And so I've learned a lot along the way already. And it is full-time work, and social media before this book, I was not a big social media guy. I used it like other people. And I've had to be very disciplined with this book to actually, continue to put out, not promotions, but just telling little stories out there, and hopefully encouraging people to buy the book.
When you do sort of promos at bookstores, are there sort of ultramarathon groupies that, there's Charlie? Like, are there sort of guys and girls that are sort of in the running scene, in the trail scene?
There are.
There
are. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. A lot of times too, what happens when I'm traveling around is, once again, because of social media, very often there's people that I've been in touch with, or that have reached out to me in the past and asked a question, either about sobriety or about running or that kind of thing. And then I come to their town or somewhere close enough, and they come and meet me, and we have a talk, and I think that's been fun for them, but it's also a lot of fun for me, because social media, you have your real friends, and then you have your Facebook friends, and it's been fun to actually meet some of these people that I've had a lot of contact with, but I've never really I've never seen them in person. So it's been a pleasant experience so far, and I do think that my book, similar to others that I think you've mentioned that you've read in the running world, I do actually believe that it's got a long shelf life, and I think it's a book that people will continue to discover for a while.
Yeah. It's a type of book that, I'm not much of a reader, but I prefer to consume audio books. I just find it easier to get through them. Yeah, I loved it. This is the type of book that you could listen to multiple times and get more from it every time you listen to it. But,
yeah, thank you.
One of the sorry, yeah.
No, I was going to say I also listen to audiobooks a lot, and it's because of running, actually. So I do, if I'm doing a very long training run, I don't necessarily do it so much in races, but if I'm going to run for 4 hours or 8 hours or something silly, then I love the audiobooks, and it takes me to a whole different place.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a real privilege to have you on the podcast. I guess you're a celebrity, an ultra running celebrity, particularly, with your new book out. And a number of years ago, you were one of the stars of Running the Sahara, which is an incredible documentary as well. And we can talk about that. But basically,
Sure.
you and Ray Zahab and Kevin Lin.
Kevin Lin, yeah.
Yep. So you guys ran across the Sahara Desert. I think it was 111 days. You did sort of double marathons for 111 days with no rest. So yeah, you've done a whole heap of incredible ultras. You know, you've done Badwater a number of times, you know, sort of top 5 finishes. You've won the Gobi March a couple times, which was a 250K race. Jungle Marathon in Brazil. Race Across America, another documentary.
Mm-hmm.
With your book, there's a couple sort of major themes that really sort of jumps out at me and the reader, I guess. One is addiction, and there's another one, suffering. I sort of want to delve into those two.
Sure.
So with your, I guess, your teens, you sort of got right into the drug scene. Can you maybe tell us about that? So how did you sort of discover drugs and sort of fall into that particular path?
Yeah, I think it happened the way it happens with a lot of people. I certainly had a genetic predisposition to addiction, and a lot of family members, on both sides of my family had struggled with addiction. And when I reached college, I was 17 years old, and, I had been I say this sort of jokingly, but also, it's sort of true. I mean, in high school, I'd been a bit of an overachiever and class president and good grades, and I played all the sports and dated the cheerleaders, and I got to college and I expected to be a standout in college, and I reached the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and there's 4,000 other freshmen there, and they all have the same credentials that I do, and they're all smart and athletic, and I sort of got lost as a freshman. And the drinking age back then in North Carolina was 18 years old, which everywhere now here in the U.S. it's 21, but that changed years later. But when I was in college, it was 18, and I discovered very quickly that I could still be a standout, but it was in drinking and partying, and somehow I was just attracted to that, and I like a lot of college students, I spent a lot of time partying, but my classmates would stop partying at 2 a.m. and get up and go to class the next day, and I wouldn't stop. I would just continue on through the night and not go to class, and then the next day do it again. And I developed this pattern, and it really took me, this continued into adulthood, and what I did to offset it was to continue to actually overachieve. I was always the top salesman at my job, and I got married, and I bought houses, and I did all these things to make myself look like a normal person. Meanwhile, I, was constantly behind the scenes battling this addiction and losing most of the time. And it took me nearly 10 years, to actually break that pattern and find my way out of addiction. And after nearly, being killed a couple of times, I decided it was probably a pretty good idea to quit. So, that's really that's a very short version of the story, but I think that the addictive part of me, it's just it's part of my personality, and it actually makes me good at certain things like running and like jobs.
With your book, you sort of go right into detail around. I think your main sort of drug of choice was Coke at the time, and then you sort of fell into, or I guess you moved from Coke into crack, and some of the stories that you outline in your book, particularly around sort of the crack dens that you sort of, you'd spend a number of nights, days and nights with no sleep, just getting high. That would have been quite an experience to sort of live through. You sort of see stuff on the movies and stuff like that with, real full-on crack dens and that, but you sort of lived through that.
Yeah, well, it was horrible. It was, nobody would ever choose to live their life that way, because there's no redeeming qualities in that, and there's nothing positive, out of it. When I made the deal with Simon & Schuster, my publisher, for this book, I had interest from 5 of the big publishers, and I really said to them that, look, I'm not interested in writing a running book. There's nothing wrong with that, but I don't want to write a book of running stories. I've done enough events, I could do that, but I wanted to write a book that really told my story without holding back, because also I hoped that maybe it would encourage other people who have addiction issues and who feel like their life is hopeless and out of control, to realize that there are ways to get out of that. But so to that end, I took people in the book, I took them with me into this dark underside.
I think it set up the book quite well. It sort of showed like an aspect of you that really almost sets up your career into running. That sort of addictive side of you back then, particularly with the drugs and stuff, was almost like a precursor to your addiction to extreme endurance and ultra long distance running.
No, you absolutely are correct, and I spent years sort of trying to figure out the balance, between them, and people would ask me, not surprisingly, they would ask if I just switched addictions, and I always said I spent the first 5 years of my sobriety trying to kill the addict, trying to almost beat it out of me and make that addiction part of me go away. And I finally came to understand that the addictive part of my personality is what actually makes me good at things. And so what I needed to do was not kill the addict, but learn how to work with that part of my personality but not let it drive me crazy. And, and as it turns out, the skill of being able to stay up 3 or 4 nights in a row without sleep turned very handy with respect to doing adventure racing, like the Eco Challenge and those kinds of races. For those of you in your audience who know the Raid Go Waz and the Eco Challenge, and Australians, I think, grow up much more with an adventurous angle to their lives than most Americans do. And so, I figured out that part of the skill set that needed to be successful, though, was actual sleep deprivation, which is not really a recommended thing to train for. but I was pretty good at it, as it turned out.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I think it is a thing, particularly if you're training for a 100-miler, to really incorporate in your training the actual sleep deprivation side of things. Like if you can regularly set your alarm, quite early every day for a number of days or weeks sort of leading up, just to sort of keep yourself, I guess, tired leading up to like a 100-miler. That's sort of another aspect of training that a lot of people sort of do incorporate.
Well, and I think I always tell people that are training for, hundreds or even longer races, you should you can get some sleep even from 6 p.m. until 11, and then you should get up and try to run from midnight to 6 a.m. because it's different. If all you've ever done is run during the daytime, you just don't know what it feels like to be that exhausted, and nighttime everything slows down, and I think it's an important part of training is to understand what you're going to be facing. And the only way you can do that is to actually do it.
I've got to ask, I'm just looking on Wikipedia, in 2005 you won the 220K jungle marathon in Brazil. Is there much sort of night running through the jungle?
Well, in that race, there wasn't a lot of night running, except we did start very early a couple of times. But I still say that race was very possibly the hardest race I've ever done. There's a very funny story about what happened in that. The original version that I wrote for the book got cut back dramatically, but I actually was entered in this race, and I missed a flight in the United States in Washington, D.C., and I wasn't able to make it because there was only one flight to Manaus, which is, in the Amazon, one flight per week at that point. And I missed it because of not because of my fault, but it just a connection was missed. And so I had to call the race director and tell her that I wasn't going to be able to make it. And she called me back and said, look, if you can get to this other city by, this day, I'll send a helicopter for you. And anyway, long story short, that all happened. I ended up in a helicopter over the Amazon jungle for a day and a half. And I arrived at the start of the race at, 10 minutes before the beginning of the race. And this helicopter lands on the beach and lets me out, and there I am for the start of the race. I don't know how many people, another 200 people out there waiting, and I just looked like a total jackass, of course. Here
Who's this
I
guy
am.
coming in on a helicopter?
Exactly. What a tool! That was my that's what I felt like, and so there was a ton of pressure on me, and so I went out that very first day, and the race started, 10 minutes later, and I ran harder than I've ever run before in my life. And I won the first stage, and I felt like it was really important that I prove, I guess, that it was worthwhile to go to all that trouble to get me out there. Yeah. But that's where I met Ray Zahab, who ended up being my teammate for the Sahara. So, and Kevin Lin was there also. And so really that race set the stage for running the Sahara.
Yeah. Got to ask, how many 100-mile races have you run, or like 100-mile distance or further? Mm-hmm. Do you know how many you've done? How many of you done?
I think I've done, there's people who've done a whole lot more than I have, but I think certainly in the 50 to 60 range at this point. I have friends, I have a couple of friends who've done, more than 100, and one guy, I think he's done 150, Ed Eddinghausen. I don't know if you know who he is. He calls himself the Jester. Have you ever seen that guy? He sort of dresses this crazy hat on like a court jester. And he also happens to be very fast. So he's, I think last year he set a new world record. You should have him on sometime. Yeah. He set a new world record for, most hundreds in a year, and I believe he actually ran more than 40 hundreds just last year.
Really? Jeez, that'd be full on.
My body, I don't think could take that, but I abused it too much in my 20s. But and also, there has to be balance, and I ran like an addict for years. And I was going to say this earlier, but the big difference. And you obviously have done a lot of running yourself, and you understand that it can be all consuming. But when I was a drug addict, all I thought about was the next high, the next drug. Even if I went a week or 2 weeks without doing anything, somehow I was plotting and planning my life around the next time that I would go out there and do something stupid. And addiction is all about hiding your personality and about being invisible. And running is the opposite, right? Running is all about, there's no hiding when you're running. Yeah. You are the sort of essence of who you are. And it's there for everyone to see. And you're not masking anything. And so I think that's why when people compare, it's not totally fair, because, as a runner, my goal was to feel everything, good and bad. And as an addict, I didn't want to feel anything.
What in terms of running, you've done heaps of expeditions as well. What is it about? Do you sort of prefer expedition style runs versus single stage 100-milers?
I do.
Yeah,
I do, and I think it's because usually there's a cultural aspect to a stage race or to a longer expedition style race. And so with adventure racing early on in the early 2000s, I did sort of every major race in the world for about 5 years, and it took me to Australia and to New Zealand and to Fiji and Vietnam and Borneo and all of these amazing places. And I've just never been interested in being a tourist. I don't want to see some cool place while I'm riding in the back of a tour bus. It's like, I don't want someone else telling me why it's cool. I want to experience the real thing. And that's all about culture. There's physical beauty with respect to the terrain and the topography. But the way you really learn about a country is to learn about its people and to actually spend time with them. And, I'll tell you, there's a very small story about running the Sahara. When I was planning running the Sahara, I went to Africa for a scouting trip a year before. And when I would drive into one of these little villages and get out of my Toyota Land Cruiser, all the kids and even, adults, they had learned, that strangers coming in cars meant, wealth, or meant a certain thing. And so they would come, and they would basically come with their hands out, and they would ask for things, whatever it might be. And, a year later, when I was running through some of these same villages, I would run into town and no one would ever ask me for anything. Maybe it's because I looked like I didn't have anything, but it changes the dynamic, and it's so unusual. It gets people to open up and show you what their life is really like. And I think there's just really great power in that.
With the Running the Sahara, as you sort of come across these small little villages that aren't even on maps, do the locals sort of offer food and drink? As you three sort of rocked up you've just sort of come from the desert, you've entered this random village.
Mm-hmm.
Do any of the locals sort of offer, They do.
Yeah. They do. And they not only do they offer, Matt, they offer you, even out in the middle of the desert, because the Tuaregs, which are the native people of the Sahara, they're nomadic people. So they're just traveling around, living their lives, and we would encounter people in the middle of nowhere who quite literally are the definition of having nothing, and nothing, as we would see it. And, they would offer food, they would offer water, they would offer anything that they have, they would offer. And it was actually very complicated because I learned very quickly that, for example, camel's milk really upset my stomach, but because I just wasn't accustomed to it. And so everyone wanted to offer it, and I had to learn how to politely take, the smallest sip, but not really even drink any, because it would upset me. I was so humbled by the fact that they were offering me what they had. And, I'm actually a vegetarian and about 98% a vegan. And it's very complicated sometimes. And I always tell my friends, even those who might be a little judgmental about the way I do things, if I'm going through some village in a place where they have absolutely nothing, by my standards, I can't turn down or turn my nose up at offering me, because it's just, it feels bad. I'm not there to educate them on being a vegan. And in the middle of the desert, there's no vegetables. These people are living the best way that they know how. And, I think adaptation sometimes is the best way through. And when I'm at home, I can live my life any way I choose. But if I'm going to go into other people's cultures, I need to be respectful of that.
Just to give some listeners some context, for those who haven't seen Running the Sahara, you ran about 4,300 miles from the west coast of Africa in Senegal to Egypt. So it's just under 7,000 kilometres, 111 days non-stop without a break, back-to-back, like double marathons every day. There was one particular scene in the movie, can you tell us about, you guys came across like a little boy in the desert?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, and first of all, who knew Africa was that big? It didn't look that big on the map. So, it's like, apparently I didn't do a good job. No, so this particular scene was when we reached Mali and Niger, which are, kind of in the geographic center of the Sahara Desert. We encountered, many people who seemed to be just barely hanging on, but this one little boy in particular really hit home for me, because he's just by himself, 7 or 8 years old, out in the middle of the desert, and he's tending to a small flock of sheep, or goats rather, and his parents have gone, on a 2 or 3 day journey to get water. And this was not uncommon for him. And he was, what I always found interesting is, he was far more afraid of us than he was of being alone in the desert. This was his life. He only knew this version of life. And, it was an incredibly humbling moment. And one of the things about an expedition like that is it's not like and this was 10 years ago, by the way. So right now, like right this minute, we have just entered 10 years ago, we've just entered Mali. So it's a very interesting time to be talking about this, but it's not like I could get his email address or, so to this day, I have no idea whatever happened to that little boy. And it's it occupies my mind quite often. I think about him. I think about other people that I met out there, especially those that were struggling. And I wonder if they're still alive or whether their water situation has changed. Our mission was to be the first people to run all the way across the Sahara Desert. But our secondary mission was to bring attention to the need for clean water in that part of Africa. And sub-Saharan Africa gets most of the attention because that's where the large population bases are. But the Sahara, of course, is the driest place on Earth pretty much. And it doesn't rain, and they struggle with water. And we ended up raising, Matt Damon was the producer of the film, and he narrated the film. And, we raised together more than $6 million for clean water projects there. And I'm happy to say that that's actually the real legacy of that run. The run was life-changing for me in many ways, but the legacy of water is what really made the difference.
Did you ever go on any runs with Matt Damon at all? G'day guys, Matt here. This podcast is a labour of love, and all episodes are researched, scheduled, edited, created and promoted in my spare time. Typically, after an episode has been recorded, it can take another 3 hours of post-production activities to get the final cut. If I'm providing you with value and you wish to support my vision of sharing these inspirational stories to the world, you can do so at borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. Your support will help to maintain the monthly podcast running costs and enable me to outsource repetitive tasks so I can bring you even more Kick Arse episodes. Once again, if you want to support me in producing this podcast, head over to borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. You can't miss it. And now back to the rest of the show. Did you ever go on any runs with Matt Damon at all?
I did. When I met him, actually, the very first time I actually met him in New York City, we were talking about doing this project together, but it was all through agents and other people. And he actually said, "Hey, I want to talk to you." And I popped up to New York City, it's a very short flight from where I live. And we ran 10 miles together. And actually he's a very good runner. So he's a good athlete. And one of my own favorite lines from the book, and I mean, it was a real conversation I had. And he basically said at the end of that run, he said, 10 miles is really it's all I can do, because my body starts to break down after 10 miles. And I did look at him and I said, well, you just need to change your relationship with pain.
Yeah.
And I wasn't trying to be profound. I mean, it really just was what I meant, because anybody, as I always say, anybody that's ever run, if you've run a marathon, you can run 100 miles. If you've run a half marathon, you can run a marathon. It's about committing to something different and understanding it's not going to be easy. And he went on to do more running and longer running after that run together.
Were people sort of yelling out, "Jason Bourne"?
They were.
Were they?
They were. The funny thing about running, of course, is that it took them, 2 seconds. We were already past them by the time they figured out who it was. And yeah, I don't understand. Nobody yelled out, "Charlie Engle." Yeah, they were all yelling out Jason Bourne. And he is actually an incredibly nice guy. I mean, I would say I've met a few, I've met a few stars, and in fact, I had a great friendship for a while with Russell Crowe, one of your own down there, who has, I think he's loved by many and probably not loved by a few, and and again, he also was very real. He was very much like his, the personality I had come to know from watching.
Yeah,
and there wasn't a whole lot of star attitude. There was just kind of normal. Matt Damon was just a normal guy.
Just on, I guess, in terms of the Running the Sahara sort of context, there was one bit in your book, like I listened to the audio version and I was driving to work, and there was one part of the book that for me was so profound, I actually had to pull over and take note of the actual time that this particular quote or paragraph was came across in the book. Do you mind if I read it out?
Please.
So it was sort of towards the end of chapter 11, and you guys were this particular chapter was on running the Sahara, and you guys were in Egypt. So I'm guessing you might have been about 100 days into the run. Okay. And I just sort of listened to it just before this interview, but Don, he'd left. Doc and Chuck Dale were leaving to get medical supplies for you guys. And you had made a decision to ditch the 50 miles a day and basically go further than that. So the actual quote from the book that I found really profound was, and I'll just read it out. We would go for as long as we could every day. We were all ready for this to be done. It made sense to push ourselves to our max. But I also had another motive. I wanted us to suffer. We had all been weak and we had all been strong. And now I wanted us to all be empty. That was the only sure way to let in something new. I sort of found that really profound. Like when you're completely empty, like, you guys have been running for, let's just say, around about 100 days at this point. Back-to-back marathons for 100 days over sort of the harshest terrain in the world. And the fact that you wanted to just go that extra mile instead of doing 50 miles a day, go further. And you really wanted you and the other guys to really, really suffer. Can you talk about that? Like, what is it about suffering that can bring tremendous meaning to your life, especially through running?
Yeah. Well, I think some of it was a leftover of my years of addiction. At that point I was, I'd been sober a long time, like 13, 14 years. So it wasn't like I was newly sober, but I was still on this quest, I think, I like to look at it this way, like scrape out my insides. And I wanted to, I wanted to just clean it all out and like shine a bright light into the corners of who I was and see if I couldn't clean out more of that, because I felt like it would give me the opportunity to, to start fresh and to learn more. I mean, you've run 100-miler, you said, and there's something about, like, why would you do that unless you want to learn something new about yourself? Because how often in life do we get, I think the most important thing, and I love that you chose that quote, what it says to me, and I think to anybody out there that reads or listens to the book, is if you're going to take something on, it should something big and different. It should be something that changes you. And I wanted to make sure, we had already suffered for 100 days out there, and not just physical suffering, but emotional suffering. It wasn't an easy crossing. And I wanted to make sure that we didn't leave anything, untouched. And look, when you're talking to your mates and you're talking about, a race, or if you describe your 100-miler that you ran, my guess is the best stories from that race that you ran are the ones that highlight how difficult it was. And this isn't like making you look better or whatever, but the ones when you wanted to quit. Like I always say, if I'm doing a race, I don't care what it is, at some point, if it's, 100 miles or longer, I fully expect that sometime during that event, I'm going to want to quit. And that's what I wanted out of the end of the Sahara. I wanted to make sure that we didn't come home and that, a couple weeks after I started feeling better and I gained weight again and my body was recovering, that I didn't go, gosh, I wish we had just worked a little bit harder. And, thanks to pushing all the way to the finish line of that run, I think we learned a lot about each other. We certainly learned about ourselves individually. And, there's no doubt in my mind that it changed all three of us. And I knew when I started that run, I had a stated goal. I wanted to be different when the run was over. And I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't know how I would be different. But I wanted to just, I wanted to see the world in a different way when Running the Sahara was over. And that's exactly what happened.
Do you ever come down from those highs? Like from running, you've done all these, like your resume is incredible. Do you ever come down, you've, like at the end of Badwater, like you've crossed the Badwater finish line and, Running the Sahara and all these other ultras that you've done. Every single time, pretty much every ultra that you toe the line, whether you finish or not, it changes you. But do you find you ever come down from those particular life experiences, or do you just keep getting higher and higher?
No, I don't think you come down from them, and I think part of it is, and I like to use Badwater as an example because it's, Badwater doesn't change. Death Valley's the same. It's a place that doesn't change much at all, and yet I've done it 6 or 7 times, and I'm the one that changes. So I like going back every few years. A lot of times, for years I went every year, but now it's every, maybe 3 years. I plan to go back next year, and that will be 4 years since I did it last. And, and I like to sort of measure myself against a course that I know and see if I can actually do better. And that doesn't always mean going faster. It can just mean having a different experience. But I rarely do the same race over and over. Badwater is like the only one. Partly because, look at the world now. There's so many amazing events out there in the world. And I want to come back to Australia. I want to go and do events in places around the world where I haven't experienced. And so that high does continue for me because I always have something new to look forward to.
Do you ever, you're one of the most accomplished ultra runners on earth, and, you got heaps of people who haven't done anywhere near what you've done, asking you for advice and trying to extract wisdom and knowledge from you. Alternatively, do you also have mentors or sort of people that you look up to that you try and extract knowledge and wisdom from like an ultra perspective?
That's a great question. Mine tend to not necessarily be ultra runners. Although, I love the story, for example, of Ernest Shackleton, who was an explorer over 100 years ago, who was, on his way to Antarctica and got his ship stuck in ice. Do you know this story?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And, and so Shackleton, and I'll keep it very brief, but to me, his most famous saying was, a quote by him was that, optimism is true moral courage. And what I try to do is look at life and look at things optimistically and to understand that good and bad things happen to me and to everyone else. And it's not about what happens to us, right? All that matters is what we do with what happens to us. It's how we react, how we adapt to the things that go wrong. And I like Shackleton's story because he took 26 men on this expedition and they were stuck in the ice for 22 months, almost 2 years, and genuine, true explorers like we don't have anymore. And yet he never lost his optimism. And what I try to get at, and I try to have mentors that have the same mindset, is anybody can be optimistic when things are going your way. But who are you and how do you react when everything goes to hell? Because that's what really determines, what kind of person you are, I think, and also, how you are going to feel about the experience later. So I have a couple of friends that I tend to call, and they are ultra runners, and they're not necessarily, they're accomplished, but they're not, winning big races, but they're people that I admire. A friend named Chris Roman, who's a doctor in Florida. I usually, if I have some new idea, or as I like to jokingly say, some new bad idea about, wanting to run across a country or do something crazy, I call him first just to see what his reaction is. And he tells me, he's a friend, so sometimes he'll say, you know what, that's a really stupid idea. Don't do that. And,
I just got to ask, you've done all these ultras all around the world. How do you fund it? Are you sponsored, or do you get to a certain level with your athletic prowess where sponsors or race organizers just sort of pay for you to come and do their event? How does this sort of work at your level?
Yeah, very often that's what happens. I've certainly paid for a lot of events, but and I always tell race organizers the truth, which is, and sponsors, I certainly can't guarantee that I'm going to win the race, because there's such amazing talent out there in the world now, in the running world. And these young guys and girls are coming in, and they're doing things I never thought possible. I always thought that you had to be old and have a little bit of experience to, win a 100-miler. And now, at least here in the United States, we have these kids that are 20 years old that have never even run a marathon before, that are winning races. So I tell my sponsors, I'm like, look, I can't guarantee that I'm going to win, but I can guarantee you that, I will probably get some coverage, whether it's deserved or not. And most of the time I can find a sponsor to pay for an event. And, sometimes I have to just not go. If it's an expedition and I'm going to make a film, I mean, Running the Sahara is a great example. That was a very big budget project, and, in the millions of dollars. And certainly that had nothing to do with my money, because I don't have money. I'm certainly not a wealthy person. And so, I have to pick and choose events that I can afford to do. And, sometimes that means that I'm getting a sponsor to pay for it. And, again, what I promise them always is that I'll give it my best effort. I'll do all the interviews that they can set up. And I also, it's funny, sponsors are funny for me, because I'm not a salesman. I am a salesman, but I'm not that guy that can, talk about how awesome some nutritional product is. It's not that a lot of them aren't great, but I'm not comfortable doing that. And I don't mind like photos of me using the product, but I want it to be organic. I want it to be something that looks normal. And I just don't think that if I'm holding up, a can of something that I'm going to drink or eat, I don't think that's very organic. Yeah. So I try to pick and choose, but yeah, I don't, these are expensive events a lot of times. And so I have to find, a way, but, I don't live to make money. And I think that, I've spent most of my money through the years on having life experiences, because I know that those will last me for as long as I live.
Yeah. Just with the, you made the comment before of, you're not a wealthy person, but I sort of see you as extremely wealthy in terms of, what you've experienced. I just want to find out, when you're sort of either doing an expedition or 100-miler or something major, you're human and, you do go through your ups and downs. How do you sort of get through those really, really low points, where your mind is just collapsed and your spirit's pretty much crushed, yeah, and you're just really contemplating pulling the plug? Yeah. Do you sort of have any tips or techniques that you use yourself to try and get yourself out of that rut or that hole?
Yeah, I do. And there's two things. Number one, and not everybody can do number one, because they may not have the same background that I do, but I will tell you, I keep little notes. I have a tattoo on my right wrist that I see when things get difficult, and it's a reminder of my years of drug addiction. And I can tell you 100% that I have never experienced a single moment in running that even comes close to comparing to my worst moments in addiction.
Really?
And so first thing I do is remind myself that, I'm there voluntarily, and this suffering will end, whatever it is. With running, that suffering will end. But with addiction, there was no guarantee that was ever going to end. And so that's number one. The more practical view, though, is this, and I tell ultra runners all the time, have a plan when you go into a race, because if you don't have a plan, you're setting yourself up for failure. Because if you're running 100 miles, you are going to crash at some point. I've never known a single runner that's run 100 miles and never had a moment of, complete destruction. But here's the thing. This is an absolute guarantee. 99.9% of the time, if it's not an injury or something like that, it's all about hydration and nutrition. And so usually when you hit those low points, those super low points in a race, it's because you're calorie deprived. And you have to be prepared for it. So I make sure that I've got like literally 1,000 calories in my pocket all the time.
Yeah.
And I never stop. I try not to sit down. My joke is the chair is the enemy, and I try to never sit down unless I'm changing shoes or something. But try to keep moving, keep eating, and putting those calories in. And every single time, 20 or 30 minutes later, I might still feel like crap, but I feel better. And it's trusting the process and just knowing that if you just keep moving past the really hard times and you give your body what it needs, the body is amazingly resilient and it will come back and it will get you to the finish line.
In the real, when you've hit the wall completely, like you at Badwater or on the Sahara expedition, have those low points been anywhere near the week-long drug benders in terms of just being
not even close? Not even close. And here's the big difference, is at the end of, a drug binge, the shame and the humiliation and the hopelessness is awful, and it's almost life-threatening, because when you're at that low point, during a drug binge or afterwards, it's it really is. I've never experienced anything like it. And those low points in a race, I do remind myself that this is for fun, although it's not everybody's idea of fun, but I'm there because I'm trying to learn something new about myself. And, I've quit a couple of times in my life, only once in a big race many years ago. And I was so distraught. I was so upset, like even an hour after I quit, that, I vowed I would never do that again unless I simply had no choice. Because in that case, this was in Tibet and Nepal, and I was doing an adventure race, and one of my teammates had to drop out. And so, but I had the opportunity with my other teammates to continue on in the race. We would just be unofficial. And I quit. We all quit. And here we are in this beautiful country. We're in Tibet, for God's sakes, and we're in Nepal, and we're in the Himalayas, and we're seeing these incredible people, and we quit because we're no longer a ranked team. And I missed out on having a great experience there. And I promised to never do that again. And it's, look, I go to these races so that I can hit those lows and that I can push past it, because that's what makes me, a day or a week or a month later, that's what makes me proud of myself. Not whether I won the race or not, but was I strong enough to continue on when it seemed hopeless?
I've got to ask as well, you've got an incredible engine, I guess. How long would it take for you to get to that point of, that point where you really question yourself whether to quit or keep going? Obviously you've got an incredible endurance. Does it take you, I guess, because you've got all this experience, does it take you longer and longer to get to that point of that breaking point?
It does. And I think actually, though, it's more about my approach. And I'll give you an example. Badwater is a good example. And like in 2013, the last time I did Badwater, and this is pretty normal for me, but I was in, I think I was probably, there's usually 90, maybe 100 runners total in the race. And I was probably, I don't know, 40th or something like that at the halfway mark. And, that's the big difference, is I trust the process. And I ultimately ended up finishing 5th place, and I set a new record for my age group. I broke the old over 50 age group record by 3 hours. And, and I came in 5th in the overall standings. And I guess the point is, I don't start off too fast. One of the things about youth and inexperience, no matter how old you are, is that every runner tends to go too hard in the beginning. And at a race like Badwater or any 100-miler, and again, I don't know what your experience was, but my goal is to run, the second half of the race as fast or faster than I ran the first half. And the only way that's possible is to go very slowly in the first half and take my ego out of it. I've done a lot of stupid things in my life, and I've had things happen to me that have crushed my ego, and I like it that way because, ego is the thing that gets us in trouble in a race, because someone else passes us, or we're, for whatever reason, we think we have to stay with everyone else. And it's remembering that you're really out there alone. There isn't anyone else for me. I'm not worried about what kind of race you have, or what kind of race, Dean Karnassus or Scott Jurek has, because they're gonna do their own thing, and I can't control them. I can control me, though. And if I run my race, then sometimes I'll win and sometimes I won't. But, I think that's the only way to approach it.
You've got an addictive nature. I guess we all do to some extent. When you're sort of towing the start line of, these world famous ultras, when you're sort of looking around, to your left and your right, you see all these other well-known ultra runners. Do you think they also have some sort of addictive nature as well?
Yes. And I've talked to many of them about that exact thing. And look, it's not like we're damaged human beings, but I believe that anybody, you included, and we don't know each other well, but anybody who's ever towed the line for 100-miler, you're searching for something. And it's not to say that life is bad or there's some big hole in your life or something like that, but there's a need, a desire that's somehow not being met. And some of that is just exploration, and not just exploration of the terrain, but self-exploration, because I'm sorry, there is no better way to get to know yourself than to enter, a 100-mile race and to know that at some point out there, and if you're inexperienced, you may not understand this until you're in the middle of it, but you're going to hit a point where you're trying to fill some hole, some gap in your life, and without even knowing what that is. And so I've talked to Dean and to Scott Jurek and to many other top runners and Marshall Ulrich, and they all have the same thing. They may not be drug addicts or alcoholics, but they have addictive natures, and they have this desire not only to discover more about themselves, but also there's something that they're trying to heal in their lives, and they found the way to do that with running.
Are you spiritual at all? Do you believe there is something sort of bigger and something that you can draw upon, in those real dark and low points? Do you think, do you sort of believe, are you like a spiritual person as well?
I am. I'm definitely, I'm not a religious person at all. I don't attend any formal church or belong to any religious group, but I absolutely have seen too much evidence personally of sort of the spiritual connection that I have with both people and places. There are special people in my life that, I can feel them when they walk into a room, and there are deserts and jungles and forests and mountains that I've traveled to that I feel so incredibly close to the terrain, and I feel more alive in those situations, that it just tells me that there has to be something more. I don't look at it as a mystical, magical fairy tale sort of existence, but I think the earth has a spirit that, very much like the Native Americans and your Aboriginals, and this sort of deep connection with the earth. I think that's where I draw my spirituality.
On any of the runs that you've done ever, like, you've done so many runs, massive runs, has there ever been a particular moment on any of the massive runs that you've done where you've sort of had really deep spiritual realizations on life and stuff? Have you ever sort of...
Yeah, well, you know what? I'll tell it to you this way. It happens all the time for me, but running the Sahara is a good example, and not. I get the question, as I'm sure you get. Also, every runner gets it, and that is, how, do you, tell me about the runner's high. Do you get that? And I have always said that I have no idea what anybody's talking about, because when I'm running the 100 miles, I can't really tell you that there's ever been a time where just magically at 75 miles, I just feel fantastic because I don't do drugs anymore. So, maybe that would do it. But here's what I do feel. And it is this feeling of euphoria that happens when a run is over. And the Sahara was the greatest example because, of course, I ran, nearly 80K every day in the Sahara. And so I would get to the end of the day, and I would take this little thin foam mat, and I would lay it on the sand in the middle of the desert, and I would lie there on my mat, and I would look up at the stars, and I could see the International Space Station, and I got to know like 6 or 8 other satellites, and I would lie there and I would watch them go around. And like I could literally every hour, I could see them, sometimes every half an hour, I could see them coming over my head. And I'm looking at these, millions of stars and these satellites, and I'm just like so deeply connected to what I'm watching. And so I think the runner's high, or the spiritual connection that I felt in those moments was beyond anything I had ever felt before. And I was truly happy in those moments, And then I do make jokes about hallucinations, but that's a whole different thing. I remember one of my favorite was in New Zealand. I did the Eco Challenge in New Zealand back in like 2001, I think it was. And I can distinctly remember being up on a big ridge with my teammates, and I can't remember any of their names. This is like day 7, and we haven't slept in 3 days, and I can't remember my teammates' names. Like, I've forgotten their names. I know they're my teammates, but I can't remember their names. And I am watching in the river valley below. I'm watching a school bus drive up the river and pick up kids and drop them off. And I'm nudging my teammate going, do you see that? Do you see that? And he's looking at me like I'm absolutely out of my mind. So I would also call that that's a much different spiritual experience. But, the extreme events take your brain to all kinds of crazy places.
Yeah. I think I listened to you on another podcast, and you mentioned you had a leech in your eye. Was that true?
I did.
What happened there?
I did. In Borneo. So, man, the Borneo Eco Challenge was, first of all, it was just this massive undertaking, and we were in the jungle and completely over our heads. And my team, we were very inexperienced, and there there were Aussie teams and Kiwi teams and all these European teams that were so much better than we were, and we were really outclassed. But one of the things that happened to everyone in that race is the leeches in the jungle, they actually just fell from the trees. They would, it was unavoidable. And so I actually got into this river at one point. Everyone did. And when I got out of the river, one of my teammates looked at me and he's like, what's going on with your eye? And I actually blinked my eye and had this searing pain. And he's looking at it, and I have this tiny, it's very small, like a little inchworm. And, I have this tiny little leech, and he's stuck onto my eyeball. And, doing what leeches do, he's, trying to suck out all my blood. And so we had to get, one of my teammates was a paramedic, and he was able to get tweezers and lay me down and quite literally, reach on my eyeball and pull this thing off.
Yeah. And he had the eye open, and you would have seen the tweezers come down.
Oh, it was absolutely terrifying. One of the worst things ever. And the thing about it is, if you've ever had a leech, and you can take a little salt or Tabasco or something like that, and you can put it on the leech and it'll just fall away because they don't like salt, kind of like slugs, if you have slugs there. And, but I couldn't put Tabasco sauce in my eye. I could have. It would have been very uncomfortable. Oh,
did you skewer your thigh as well on some trail?
No, that wasn't me. That's funny that you say that, though. There's you must have a long memory of seeing Eco Challenge videotapes or something. But there was a teammate of mine who did, like, we're running down a trail, and they had cleared the trail using jetties in front of us, and what it did was turn the trail into like this very dangerous obstacle course with branches pointing at us, and they're very sharp. So one of my teammates had basically had what amounts to a bamboo pole, go all the way through his leg. So yeah, that was bad.
I've got to ask about, and this is, you go into detail about this in your book, Running Man. You spent 16 months in jail. I believe it was because you overstated your income on a home loan application, or, whatever sort of the reason was. But I wanted to ask about, and you do go into that in detail in your book, but I just wanted to ask, when you're in court and when the judge sort of, slams the hammer down and says, you're guilty, you're sentenced to X number of months in jail.
Mm-hmm.
What did your mindset, what was your sort of mindset at that point? When the hammer goes down and he says guilty, you go into jail.
Yeah. Was
your mindset similar to the mindset as when you're towing the start line of an ultra, in terms of, okay, there's nothing I can do, I'm here, and there's going to be a struggle ahead? Did you sort of have was there sort of any parallels between the mindset you had when the judge said you're guilty versus the mindset you had when you're just before the gun goes on an ultra?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Matt, and I think yes is the short answer. But I really felt I was probably the most well-equipped person in history to go to prison.
Yeah.
And that sounds like a funny thing to say, but I had been clean and sober for 19 years, and I've been running, for 19 years, very hard, and I'd been through a lot, and I understood emotional suffering because of being an addict, and I understood physical and emotional suffering from being a runner. And I actually knew instantaneously that I would get through it. Like I knew it wasn't going to destroy me, and I knew it sucked, I didn't want to go, and I didn't want to be away from my kids and my mother, and I didn't want to go. And it was, I'm not going to go into the case here. I talk about it in the book, but it was unfair in my opinion, and it was an unjust verdict. But I immediately accepted the fact that you said it very well. This is my reality, and I had to just wrap my mind around that and get ready.
Yeah.
And I ended up, it ended up being this life-changing experience for me again, in a whole different way. And it would be a stretch for me to say that it was good for me, but I do believe that I made the best of the situation. And I think being, running and addiction recovery is what made that gave me that ability.
Yeah. Were you ever worried at all that, going into jail, that you'd be exposed to heaps of drugs at all? Was that sort of
Sure.
on
I was, and there were plenty of drugs. I mean, it's very much like what you see on television, and everything was available. And look, I talk about it in the book about how I was tempted even before I went in to give up my sobriety and just screw it for a while. And, part of me wanted to escape the reality that I was facing, but that didn't last long. You said it well a moment ago, and people will think I'm nuts when I say this, but, there's that feeling you get when you've signed up for a 100-miler and you're anticipating going, and then, you go and you're there at the starting line, and you actually know for sure that it's going to be an experience that you've never had before. And that's scary, and you wonder if you can do it. And prison was very much the same way. I got there, and every single thing that I did was completely foreign to me. I didn't understand the way things worked. I'd watched enough television and movies to know, I wasn't going to go punch the biggest guy in the prison.
Yeah, take out the
unless I just wanted to get my ass kicked. I wasn't doing that, but I knew instinctively that I was going to learn some things. And as you saw in the book, what I really learned was I had something to offer in there. And a lot of the people that I was in prison with had never, they've been in and out of the system their entire lives, and they knew nothing about, physical fitness, and they knew nothing about sobriety, and they didn't know any of these things. And I had a chance to actually share those ideas with them. And I think a lot of them left prison with a more positive outlook because they learned how to be runners, and they learned how to maybe think more about their diet and nutrition. And they also knew that they didn't have to choose drugs and alcohol. They could choose a sober life and one that would probably mean they wouldn't go back to prison again.
What's it like when, you're in prison, you're locked up, and you're sort of telling stories either to your cellmate or, other guys, in the library or on the running track, and you're sort of dropping these stories. Oh yeah, I've won the 250K Gobi March, and I've run across the Sahara, and I've done Badwater multiple times. Do they sort of believe you, or?
No, they did not believe me. And in the beginning, I have to tell you, I learned I didn't even learn very quickly. I knew this instinctively because I wasn't a young guy going in there. And that is that I really just kept to myself, and I didn't talk about myself. And it took at least a couple of months before anybody realized that I was, some fairly well-known runner and all of that kind of stuff. And eventually people find out because there's always somebody that's going to snoop around and figure it out. And, and so when that happened, I did get a lot of questions. And so I would answer the questions one-on-one. But in general, I just minded my own business, and I wrote every day. I mean, it really, the time in prison is what allowed me to actually get started on writing my book. And, our busy lives, normal day-to-day lives, I didn't do a good job always of being focused and sitting down to actually work on something. And, being locked up in the strangest way, it was a gift because it allowed me this opportunity to have really focused time to write. And by the way, the book is like, I think it's 270 pages long. It's around 300 pages, but I probably wrote 800 pages that had to be edited because, I really wrote, everything about my life. And being locked up actually allowed me that opportunity.
Just for listeners, won't go into probably too much detail, but
yes, yeah. Yeah, well, I had one of these moments where, Badwater was still a couple of months away, and, in my mind, I mean, one of the things I learned how to do in prison was to run, but to really almost meditate when I ran, and, I would take my mind somewhere else, and I imagined being at Badwater and running, and like, just boom, I just had this idea. I was like, well, I can't go to Badwater. I can't physically go out there, but I physically can run the distance, and I can simulate my own Badwater, in jail. And, so I always joke, I had cut off sweatpants and a cotton tank top and cotton socks, and I had shoes that were the kinds of shoes that a normal runner wouldn't wear on the outside. They were Nikes, but they were probably 5 years old and just beaten up, and and I had no fancy nutrition or sports drinks or those kinds of things. I had won a couple of packets of Gatorade, and so I had saved those for this day. But I ultimately ended up running 81 miles on the very first day, and then I'm locked up, so I had to report back to my cell, and then come back out the next day and and finish the run and do the other 54 miles. And it was a great experience.
Did word get out? Like after the first day, you did sort of 80 odd miles. Were the other sort of prisoners? Was word sort of spreading? This guy's crazy. He's doing 80 odd miles.
It did spread. It did spread. Unfortunately, the guards found out too, and it's interesting because it's technically illegal, at least in the prison where I was, to run more than 3 miles at one time. I used to joke that I guess they were worried that if you escaped, you'd be able to run everybody if you ran more than that. So I was technically breaking the rules by doing it. So once word got out and the guards found out, I had one instance in particular where, one guard came up to me while I was out there on the track, and he asked me, he said, so I hear you're running this long distance. And I was like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he looked at me and he's like, I know what you're doing. He says, just, don't quit or get it done. And he was actually very decent about it. And I think even he enjoyed that I was on, a challenge like that. And so it was interesting. Everyone sort of rallied around me in a very unlikely circumstance. And it was another cool experience. And there were no I didn't get a finisher's medal or, nobody was there to take care of me afterwards, but it was a great experience.
How long have you been sober for?
Yeah, so I'm now at 24 years and a few months. Yeah. So it's been a long time.
So what, no drinking at all? You don't drink?
Yeah, no drinking, no, nothing. So not even a sip of beer or a glass of wine or anything. And I always say to people, because I get that question, couldn't you just have a beer? And I'm like, well, probably. I could probably today maybe have just one beer, but tomorrow I'd have 5 beers, and a week from now I'd have 20 beers. And I jokingly say that I gave up my membership card a long time ago. I proved that I was not capable of keeping it under control, and so and for me at this point, I can't even imagine how that would improve my life. So hopefully I never go back down that road.
What's harder for you, or what's been, I guess, harder, staying sober for these 24 years? Every time you're sort of out, at a barbecue or out at a restaurant or something, and, oh yeah, Charlie, do you want a beer? Or, sort of staying sober over the last over 2 decades, or massive expeditions? What's harder?
The sober for sure, but it's not that it's hard to stay sober. It's just hard to be human. We all know life is difficult, and there are times when it certainly seems like it would be easy just to disappear in a bottle, or to get drunk with my mates and just forget about everything. And I'm married to this amazing, wonderful woman who, she drinks. She has a glass. She's a normal person though, and she drinks. When we go out to dinner, she has a glass of wine, and that's it. That's the end of it. And if she has any more than that, she actually feels lousy. So her body tells her what my body didn't say. Mine would always say, I want more. And but I think the sobriety is just harder. Expeditions are fun and they're crazy and they're fraught with all kinds of danger. But with sobriety, it's very black and white. There's no gray area, because if I choose to ever pick up a drink or a drug again, it basically means that I've chosen to die, because I'm not the kind of guy. This conversation right here has proven that. I'm not the kind of guy that does well in that sort of safe middle ground. I'm either going to be all in or all out, and that's how I like it. And so, again, if you ever see me with a beer in my hand, just hard and tell me to get my act together, because I've made a very bad error in judgment.
What's been your proudest moment? Do you have anything that really sticks out in your mind, whether it's from an athletic perspective or not? Is there a really proud moment that sort of jumps out at you?
Yeah, it's people would assume maybe that it is finishing the Sahara, but honestly, very often, and I don't know if you experience this with your 100-miler, while you're elated to be finished with something, there's joy. There's also sadness in those moments, because, like with the Sahara, I planned that run for 2 years, and it took us almost 4 months to cross. And when I finished, I knew instinctively that this was over. I was never going to get to do this again. And, that part of my life, that learning experience was over. So the meaningful moments are the ones where, I get to go to high school graduation for my kids, and I get to see them have relationships. And because, I thought I was going to die for a long time. I didn't expect to be alive to see my children, who are now, my two boys are both in their 20s now. And I didn't expect to see them, grow up and live their lives, because I didn't think I was going to survive my addiction. And so the proudest moments I have are really ones that involve them. I mean, I'll give you another example. Just a month ago, or a few weeks ago, my wife and I were in London, and she gave a TED talk. My wife is a scientist, and she's, just this amazing, brilliant woman. And she was asked to give a TED talk to the largest group, 1,500 people in London. And it was so awesome to go somewhere and nobody wanted to talk to me. It was not about, they wanted to talk to her, and they, and I was so proud of that circumstance and of her, and also of just understanding that I don't need or want the attention so much as one of the positive things that's come out of this book is I've gotten dozens, maybe even hundreds of communications now over the months from people who are sober or who want to be sober, or they're trying to figure out what running could do for them, and how it might be able to help them find a new life for themselves. And those are all very proud moments for me, because I know that I actually have something to offer to those people.
I've just got a few more questions before we sort of wrap up. What's running sort of taught you about yourself? What have you learned over the years?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, because it changes. Again, I just when I think I've got some answers, Matt, I figure out there's way more questions. But I think that what it's taught me is that I'm very small. And look, there's always somebody faster. So if I ever get caught up in thinking like I'm the best runner out there, then I've lost my way. And so what it's taught me is that what I do get to be is an ambassador for not only for running, but even for the United States. America has an interesting, the perception of Americans around the world, especially these days, is very complicated. And it's taught me, though, that I do have an opportunity to go out there and show people. I think that that Americans are, we're just normal people, most of us, and we're, we do have something to offer the world. And also that there's corners of the world I still want to see. I know that there's places out there that I haven't been, and that, as I get older in particular, I'm way more concerned with having life experiences than I am in winning races. Like I could pick races right now that I might be able to be competitive in and maybe even win a couple of them. But I would much rather go somewhere that I don't know all the answers, and to meet people that I've never met before, and experience culture I've never experienced.
Have you done any cold ultras, as in, sort of in really cold places?
That's a good question. Only a couple. I did one up in New York. Now I can't remember the name of it. Upstate New York was a winter, it literally was a 100-miler, and it snowed on us 2.5 feet. It snowed for, 19 hours of the race. I've done a lot of adventure racing in cold, because a lot of those were mountain races in Ecuador and in places where we were in the high mountains. But I will freely admit that heat is my preferred experience, and I would much rather. I seem to handle. Maybe it's because I'm from the southern part of the United States. I think I can handle extreme heat much better than I handle extreme cold. Yeah. So not very often.
Yeah. Now, if you could pick up a phone right now and make a phone call to the 20-year-old Charlie Engle and give him some advice, what would you tell him?
Man, what would I tell him? Stop being such a dumbass. But here's the thing, it's complicated. If you've known anybody who's an addict, like my path was set. There wasn't a lot of choice in what I was doing. I was born, genetically speaking, with this addictive gene, and it had to play itself out. So I think what I would say is, to that person, that 20-year-old self, is to stay alive, and don't get too depressed, and don't be too hard on yourself, because I was really ashamed for a long time of the person that I was, and I felt badly about myself. And I think that extended the years that I did drugs by probably 4 or 5 years. I just was in such a deep hole. And I think I would have told myself to not be so hard on myself, and to give myself a break, and to just stop what I was doing, and realize there was a better way of life.
Yeah, it's been fascinating speaking with you and trying to get as much info out of you, and you've done so many things. Whereabouts can people find you online and find your book?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's been my pleasure. The time has flown. So you did a great job. When you ask good questions, I like to think you get good answers. So charlieengle.com. So I have a website that I redid recently, and so there's a lot of information on there. I've started writing a blog again that I'm going to start doing a lot more of in this coming year. Facebook, of course, all the normal places, Instagram, and it's all just on my name. So I have an athlete page on Facebook, and my personal page has too many people on it, but I'm easy to find. And if people want to communicate with me, they can send emails to me. My email address is right on my website. And I'm easy to find on Facebook. I'm just Charlie Engle on Instagram, and at Charlie Engle on Twitter. And, at this point, I'm happy to say I'm very responsive still. And, I do my best to always get back to people. So if it's about running or it's about sobriety, then, you can reach me lots of different places. Yeah. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, no, it's been great. So have you got anything sort of planned for the future? Are you going to sort of just retire and go into like a nursing home now? Or have you got any other adventures sort of lined up, or what's...
I always said that I just want to make sure that I have enough stories that if I'm sitting in my, my rocker at the old folks home, that I have better stories than everybody else does.
I reckon you would.
I think I at least could compete.
Yeah.
But I do have other expeditions, planned, and I'm working very hard on one right now that is really, I've been working on it for 6 years now, and it's a huge project, and I think now is the time, though, and it's to go from the lowest point on Earth, which is the Dead Sea, in Israel or on the Jordan side, and actually make my way all the way to Mount Everest and climb to the top. And it would, metaphorically speaking, it would be going from, the lowest place on Earth to the highest point on Earth, and symbolically, highlighting this journey that we all have, which is from our low places in life, to our quest to reach the high points.
Yeah.
And it's an expensive undertaking. It's a bit risky in a lot of ways, and but this book has actually gotten the attention of some folks who have funding and who are interested in helping to make it happen. So, the next 3 or 4 months will really be focused on planning. And, I am going to go back to Badwater in 2017 for the first time in a while, and 4 years. And I'm excited about going back there and I'll do some normal things, but I love the big expeditions, and I like planning them, and I like trying to pull them off. And so, I do have an interest in running across the U.S. again. As you pointed out, my Running America campaign it was successful in some ways, but not really from a running standpoint. And I consider that to be unfinished business. So I would like to try again.
Yeah. How old are you now? Mid-50s or early 50s?
Yeah, 54.
Do you, you've got so much experience. Are you sort of finding, the older you get, your speed's going to diminish, but do you find are you intimidated by these massive adventures at all in terms of from a physical perspective, or do you sort of find yourself physically as strong as what you were in previous years?
Yeah, I've certainly gotten slower, that's for sure. But, most of these, as I like to say, first of all, running ultras, so running 100 miles is 90% mental, and the other 10% is all in your head.
Yeah.
They really, yes, you have to have a basis of physical fitness, of course. You can't just, most people anyway, can't get off the sofa and run a 100-miler. But if you're in reasonable shape, you can actually get through a 100-miler, and a lot of people don't realize that, and they're afraid to give it a try. So I do know that, mentally I'm still in a really good place, and I can get through things. Physically, I've slowed down. The expeditions are actually much more appealing to me now more than ever because, again, frankly, I'm not interested. Everyone likes to win. And if I enter a race, of course, I would like to do well. But that no longer has a lot of meaning to me. And so an expedition is much more of a mental undertaking. I know, for example, that I can go from the lowest place on earth to the highest. I know it beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I also know that if I take it on, there will be 100 times when it seems impossible. But experience shows me that if I just keep moving forward, everything will work out.
Do you reckon you'll tap out when you're about 60 or 70, or do you reckon there's no real limit to? Are you just going to keep at it until?
Yeah, I don't think there's a limit. I don't think there's a reason to stop unless I get tired of. I could see doing more adventure travel with less of a goal in mind. Like, I absolutely would love to take my wife and buy a small camper van, something simple, and travel all over North America, and maybe go down through South America and just explore little corners of the world. Physically, though, sure, running for a very long time now has, my body is a little beaten up at times, but I love to cycle too. Like I'm a very competitive cyclist, and I actually, it sounds funny that at 54 I'm planning a new career, but I actually see, maybe in the next few years, possibly making a bit of a transition over to, maybe spending half my time cycling. And of course it's easier on the body, and you can cover more distance, and I can still feed that exploration and the competitive part of me, because I do like, I like to compete. I like to go out there with my friends and with strangers and to see who can go the fastest. I mean, I still enjoy that.
Yeah, it's been fascinating speaking with you, and you've lived an incredible life, and it's been great having you on, and love your book as well, Running Man.
Well, thank you, Matt, for the support too. It's really great. And I mean, I know that you mean it when you say you enjoyed the book, and that, that has a lot to do with, it's very important to me these days. I will admit that, as you read and as you listened to, it's not a book just for runners. I think it's for anybody. And I'm proud of the fact that very often people say the New York Times actually said that they knew there would be good stories, but they were surprised that the book was so well written.
No,
which is like a big backhanded compliment. But, I took that as a great compliment. And I think that people are enjoying the writing and not just the adventure part of it. Yeah. So thank you for having me. And, I'll come back anytime. So I appreciate it.
If the book was made into a movie, if you could pick one actor to play you, who would it be?
That's a great question. Let's see. One of the obvious answers, of course, is like a Matt Damon, which would be great. But actually, Matt's not really I think it would need to be an addict. And the two choices I have are like Robert Downey Jr. Or Charlie Sheen.
All right. Yeah, Charlie Sheen. He's sort of right. He's the poster boy of addicts.
Yeah. Well, you know what though, and most people don't know, both of those guys are runners though.
Yeah.
I mean, these are very flawed individuals, just like me, and they've been through incredible ups and downs, and a lot of them have been played out on the very public stage. And I actually think that either of them would genuinely understand, what I went through as an addict, and they're both good enough runners where I think they could pull it off in the film. Because if you're watching somebody run that actually isn't a runner, it's very obvious if they're just an actor. And I would want it to be somebody that actually looks like they can run. So yeah, those would be my two choices.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, yeah, thanks again for your time, and really appreciate you coming onto the podcast.
My pleasure, Matt. I look forward to the next time. Thanks.
Okay.
You did a great job, and best of luck to you.
Thanks, Charlie.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntokickarse.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a Kick Arse review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard, and catch you next time.